Hola, buenos dias. My name is Patrick Otellini. I'm the Chief Resilience Officer and Director of Earthquake Safety for the City and County of San Francisco. I'd like to start this morning by really thanking the hosts for putting on this amazing event. Thank you to all of you that have chosen to attend today. You're all probably very busy in your day-to-day lives, and so to take time out to talk about a subject that's often very hard to talk about is a very important step in what's happening here in Chile. I'd also really like to thank the folks at Citizen who's been helping me out the last couple of days. I not only consider you colleagues, but I consider you all friends. So thank you very much for making my first trip to Santiago a fantastic one. Oops, let me see. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about earthquake resilience in San Francisco, and I'm going to end by talking about a little bit more broad definition of resilience that we're looking at currently. But I think the story that I'd like to tell really starts in 1989 in San Francisco. In 1989, we had a 6.9 magnitude earthquake, which was actually centered about 60 miles away from the city, and we saw substantial damage in our building stock. This was a moderate earthquake by most seismological standards, but again, we saw significant damage in our buildings. Again, looking at the fact that new buildings perform pretty well, but looking at our existing housing stock, depending on where you are in the world, you start to see characteristics of that building type that often are vulnerable. So after that, once we saw that, then we knew that we were at this point where really we were beginning to talk about the risk and what do we do with it in terms of public policy. Once we understand the risk, what are the tools that we use to make informed decisions about that risk? And so at the time, our Building Inspection Commission in San Francisco began a study called CAPS, the Community Action Plan for Seismic Safety. What was very different about this is it was a bottom-up approach. This had a public advisory group of more than 100 citizens that met for over 10 years to talk about earthquake risks and what it meant to them as a San Franciscan. What did it mean to them as a community member? And so over that time, we eventually put 17 large policy goals together. And that was translated here in the first report here you see on the left, was done by the Applied Technology Council in conjunction with this public advisory group. And this really laid out the policy. And then in 2012, when Mayor Lee asked me to come as part of his cabinet and implement the 30-year earthquake safety implementation program, which is what you see here in the middle. And I understand that you can't read the far right image there, but what you see there is a timeline of 30 years and over 50 tasks that we've been focusing on mitigation as it relates to privately owned buildings. This is an important point. As a government, we've routinely passed laws or done funding to retrofit public infrastructure, retrofit city buildings. But in terms of privately owned buildings, this is a very hard policy intervention to navigate. When we first saw this, but the soft story buildings in 1989, soft story buildings are characterized by buildings that typically have several floors of residential above, and then ground floors with, first of all, not a lot of interior walls and a lot of openings in the perimeter walls. In this case, you see a lot of garages. We also see commercial storefronts in these type of occupancies. And what happens in an earthquake is you have a lot of mass, a lot of weight up here, and not a lot down here. So you start to see this deficiency right here between the first and second floor. We had several hundred of these buildings collapse in 1989. Several of them were damaged and repaired, but still display this condition of vulnerability. So when we began to talk about that, our building codes were changed in California in the late 70s to really get rid of this problem. So now if you're building a new building, obviously you're not building it with that same deficiency. But the problem is we had hundreds of thousands of San Franciscans living in these types of structures. What we wanted to do is when we talked about the social issues involved in this and making sure that equality was really important, we started to weigh that out with policy decisions. And so what we did is in 1989, the media really covered this part of town, the Marina District. And as you can see by the red there, obviously that's representing density of these buildings. So yes, we saw the most collapses there. It's also a very wealthy part of town. And so what we did when we worked with the Board of Supervisors in the community is we showed them the density of this is actually a citywide problem. This is not a wealthy area problem. It's actually for all San Franciscans, making us all vulnerable. So our ordinance that we passed in 2013 covered a particular subset of these soft story buildings. We looked at buildings that are type 5 construction, wood frame construction, 3 or more stories over a soft story condition, 5 or more dwelling units, residential dwelling units, and built before 1978. Doing that is not an easy process. To be able to pass a law to require mandatory retrofits on private property requires a great bit of outreach. A lot of it is figuring out financial incentives for the owners, figuring out financing programs so they can pay for it. And then there's another side. These are largely rental buildings, so it's about protecting the tenants in those buildings, making sure that this doesn't cause a spike in evictions. The point of this is to preserve these buildings. So if we're having tenants evicted or having tenants moved out while the construction is happening, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face. It's not a good path to actually keep San Francisco the same. So the mayor led many discussions. We did many different community meetings, and we did lots of community outreach at different professional organizations with nonprofits. And then we've done 2 of these in the last couple of years. We had this slide, this vision down here, is of an earthquake retrofit fair. We knew that owners, I held the first financing workshop in 2013, and I had a property owner come up to me and yell at me and tell me, we don't want to come back to another meeting when we talk about contractors. We don't want to come back to another meeting when we talk about design professionals. We want them all in one place. And so that's what we did. We did an open call to the design community, an open call to the construction community, and to the finance community, as well as many others, and held this fair free to the public. We had over 3,000 members of the public there that were able to talk to 160 vendors. So many of these people have never run a construction project before. So they were able to talk to the different people that they needed to be on their team to get this done. It was a huge success, and it's leading to what I think is some of the highest compliance rates of any seismic program in our country's history. As you can see, the total pool up here, when we did the noticing, was about 6,700 buildings. About 1,700 of those were screened out, so it was determined that 5,000 buildings are required to be retrofit by 2020. To give you an idea, this 5,000 buildings houses about 120,000 San Franciscans. That's roughly about 15% of our total population. I bring that up because it's important to note that this is the low-hanging fruit. This is a small bite at a very large apple. It's a very big problem, but this is a great place to start. I'm very proud of this compliance rate. It has a 99.99% compliance rate. I think the reason why it's only 99.9% is we have this one property that has not complied, but we're still working on that. But also, when you talk about people, talk to these owners about doing these retrofits, we also wanted to make sure that when people did not comply, that this wasn't just a government notice on a building. In California, we put notices on buildings if a restaurant wants to serve alcohol, if there's a change in ownership, for just about anything we put a notice on, and we didn't want to see another notice get lost in the noise there. So we actually created this placard. So this is a large PVC placard that if a building does not comply with any portion of this law, this gets affixed to the building. It's in multiple languages, and it explains to the tenants of the building that it's not necessarily a dangerous building, but this owner has missed a step in complying with a very important law. That's proven to be one of the most effective code enforcement tools we've ever seen in our city's history. We also developed a financing program. One of the things that we've learned from previous retrofit programs, in the 1990s, we started to retrofit our unreinforced masonry buildings. And the city created a very large loan fund, which was actually very unsuccessful. It was very hard for property owners to be able to navigate the process to actually get the funds. And so when we approached Soft Story, we knew we had to think differently. We had to give owners a menu of financing options because a one-size-fits-all approach to financing this does not work. So we met with the private sector. We brought on board about 10 private banks, and we didn't tell them to do anything different. We didn't tell them to change their underwriting criteria or anything that they're doing along those lines. We just said, this is something that we're going to do in San Francisco, and we want you to be at the table, and we want you to help. That's proven to be very successful. And we also launched our own financing program. So owners can actually apply to our program online to receive funds to not only make retrofits, but we saw an amazing opportunity here to also introduce clean energy improvements to these buildings. So they're able to put solar panels on, more energy efficient windows and things of that nature while they're doing the seismic retrofit. We also have a place called the Epicenter. We were both laughing about this last night that we both have this. I did notice though that hers is the British spelling of center and mine is the English or the American spelling of center. But it's an innovation hub. It's something we launched a few years ago, and it's a public space for even the most advanced earthquake engineer or the homeowner that's never even thought about this before. You can kind of see in the background, oops, I'll go back here. You can kind of see in the background here, we've built a model house with a model garage, and if you go in here, you can see some seismic bracing, what a foundation bolt looks like, things like that. It's very hands-on, and it's been a great educational place. It's also where we house a lot of our interns when they work with us during the summer. Part of my other responsibilities for the city is overseeing the city's Lifelines Council. The Lifelines Council was started by Mayor Ed Lee in 2013 and got together the city's private utility providers around the table and realized that we had actually not talked to each other in a real conversation about system recovery. And that began a conversation which ultimately led to this study, which was done by Lori Johnson in 2014, and it was an interdependency study, where we took a repeat of the 1906 earthquake, and then we talked to 11 different utility providers and tried to determine what their restoration timelines looked like. This led to a 5-year action plan, which I'm currently overseeing and managing several working groups along with the mayor. As a process, as we were going through our 30-year earthquake safety implementation program and going through the various steps, the city was also awarded a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation in 100 Resilient Cities. The metropolitan region of Santiago is a recipient of that same grant. So our colleagues there are working on this same process. And on April 18th, on the anniversary of the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, we released this, Resilient San Francisco. It's our new strategy that continues to build upon the momentum and the good work of our earthquake safety implementation program, but also begins to introduce a more holistic way of thinking about resilience. Different cities are taking a different approach because you've heard many different definitions of resilience today, and I'm not going to give you another one because I think resilience needs to be defined at the hyperlocal level. What resilience means to Santiago is different than what resilience means to other cities around the world. There's lots of commonalities, there's lots of themes that come up, but I think it's very important for it to be defined by the community here. We started this approach by looking at 6 different hazards to develop our methodology. We're looking at earthquakes, we're looking at climate change, we're also looking at sea level rise, infrastructure, social inequity, and unaffordability. So those 6 hazards are being combated by 4 different goals. The first goal is plan and prepare for tomorrow. The second goal, mitigate, adapt, and retrofit. The third goal, ensure housing for San Franciscans today and after a disaster. And the fourth goal, empower neighbors and neighborhoods through improved connections. The idea being that there's 4 large goals. Underneath these goals is several different actions. And the actions actually represent 81 different initiatives that the city is taking. In developing this, it's not something that my program runs. It's something that the entire city has come together to support. We worked with over 31 city agencies, worked with over 86 nonprofits and private sector agencies, and over 180 individuals over the last 2 years to put this strategy together. The 81 initiatives are also being tracked. Part of the goal of my office is to be able to look at these initiatives because if we're actually hitting the metrics on these initiatives, we're making our way to these 4 goals. The first goal, plan and prepare for tomorrow, really deals with the advanced planning that we've done around earthquake preparedness, but also community empowerment. The photo you see here is one of our neighborhood emergency response teams at a drill, but it really aims at kind of 3 different categories. It's prepare today for San Francisco's recovery, advance innovations in earthquake preparedness, and invest in infrastructure and transportation for our growing city, knowing that these are all very much related. Goal 2, mitigate, adapt, and retrofit, really gets at the physical intervention in the built world. And this is where the hazards start to get intertwined. We say that we can no longer afford to fight one hazard at a time, and I'll give you an example. This is waterfront construction happening at the Bay right now. Very seismically vulnerable area in San Francisco. The infrastructure there is very old and basically falling apart. We know we're going to have to rebuild it, but we also know we'd be foolish to rebuild this and not incorporate anticipated sea level rise. So by looking at this emerging science in other hazardous areas, it allows us to develop co-benefits in our infrastructure projects. Ensuring housing for San Franciscans today and after a disaster. Now this is a very nuanced sentence here. San Francisco is going through one of the worst housing crises we've ever had in our city's history. It's incredibly expensive. Families are leaving, and we're losing the diverse fabric that makes up San Francisco. So we know that's only going to be exacerbated by an earthquake. We know an earthquake's only going to make that problem worse. So the idea is not just focusing on how we recover our housing and how we get our housing back online, but what are we doing to strengthen our housing stock today and increase the supply of housing today so we can help lessen the impact of that crisis. Goal 4 is really about people. Goal 4 is about empowering neighborhoods through improved connectivity. And what I mean by that is it's not talking about your internet connection. It's actually talking about how you relate to each other. I think one of the things that's common in all cities is citizens have a hard time engaging their government. And I think it's equally true reverse, is that governments have a very hard time engaging our citizens. And so I think this is about trying to examine that connection. It's also about examining the connection between neighbors and each other. If you know your neighbors, that's a very powerful tool that you have. This is something that's going to help get you through recovery. Everyone knows in times of crisis, these neighborhoods come together. And I think it's something that we want to try to look at and encourage through the next couple years of our work. You heard me mention the vulnerability of our seawall, so I will talk about this for a moment. What you see here is actually a cross-section of the city seawall that is on our eastern bay side. San Francisco surrounded 3 sides by water, and the bay side is very vulnerable. This is all fill behind it. This is seismically unsafe, as I mentioned, not ready for a sea level rise, and it also has every major utility passing through it. So it really is a very vulnerable spot in San Francisco. It's also going to be incredibly expensive to rebuild it, so thinking outside of the box is critical when we start to think about this stuff. Part of what we've done is we've learned from what happened after Hurricane Sandy. I talked to my colleagues in New York, and they talk about what happened after the terrorist attacks in 9/11. They spent a lot of time preparing for a terrorist attack. They felt like they were very well prepared for a terrorist attack. And then Hurricane Sandy came. It was the unexpected event that got them. And out of that recovery, we saw a really interesting process called rebuild by design. And we saw that as an opportunity to have community involvement in how we redesign one of the most fundamental pieces of infrastructure at our waterfront that most San Franciscans don't even know exists. It's actually underneath the water, and so most people don't see it. And so we thought, what a great educational tool, what a great community engagement strategy, and we're well on our way to starting this design competition in January of next year. Looking at sea level rise is an interesting emerging area. We worked with RMS, and the mayor put together a stakeholder group about a year ago and said, okay, we need to develop an action plan for sea level rise. We took the first step, which was passing capital guidance directives to our own departments. So if a city agency was going to go use city money to build a new facility, they had to plan for sea level rise. But what was important is we couldn't quantify it yet. We couldn't figure out how much real estate was at risk. So RMS worked with us to develop a study that eventually understood that we are exposed to about $75 billion of real estate that could be susceptible to sea level rise. That gives us a long time to plan for this. We know it's a very slow-moving disaster. But to begin to identify that number, then you have something that you know what's at stake. Then you understand that risk. Then you can begin to plan against that and mitigate that risk. The Sea Level Rise Action Plan was released as part of the initiatives with our resilience strategy, and has already put together several working groups looking at vulnerability and looking at how we begin to integrate sea level rise more into our seismic planning for the city. This is a little bit more on the competition that I mentioned. So this design challenge is going to be an international call to designers to be able to come and really think about not only the structures in San Francisco, but the entire Bay Area. We don't look at our waterfront as a San Francisco resource. We look at our waterfront as a resource to the whole region, which makes up 101 individual cities in the Bay Area. So we know that we want to reach out to our colleagues and include them as well. And our colleagues in Oakland, our colleagues in Berkeley and Richmond and Marin County have all been at the table for this. And it's been a fantastic way, not only to do something important, but to build those relationships regionally that I think we need to implement this work. We're also launching some interesting pilots right now. We've been working with MIT's Urban Risk Lab in their Prep Hub concept. And what this is an attempt at an urban intervention that you see today, but also gives you the things that you need post-disaster. This is just an example here, but what you would see is, a bike pedal that maybe can charge your cell phone. It's kind of fun to put kids on during the day. It's something that you could see in a park. But after a disaster, everyone's relying on these. So we need to have power for these. And so there's a different way to think about what you could do. You could also put disaster preparedness materials in these. There's also talk about doing Wi-Fi networks out of them. But what we're beginning to do is we're not just going to jump into this. We're going to pilot this. So we're working with a few different public libraries over the next year to install these and test them out, see how they work. And if we can develop a prototype that works well for San Francisco, we'd love to scale this up and make it work. Here's an example of one of the prototypes that we tried last year of this down on Market Street. And it was very successful. However, we did learn a lot of lessons. And so those are being modified into the design now to hopefully make a better product. As part of developing the resilience strategy, the mayor had asked me to really focus on recovery. We do response very well in most countries, but it's the recovery where we usually have a hard time, and especially that gap between response and recovery. You've heard it mentioned here several times today. So working with the Harvard Kennedy School, we started with a very ambitious goal. We don't want to evacuate San Francisco. This is very unusual. It's very different to what most national models do and most international models do. But we also saw what happened in New Orleans. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the population essentially went to zero because the city was evacuated. And here we are, 10 years later, almost 11 years later, and the city's only back up to about 70% of what it was before Katrina. We know that if people are relocated and we're experiencing high costs of living like we are in San Francisco, these people are not going to come back. And then San Francisco looks very different than it does today. So we worked with them over several months to develop some recommendations, and it ended up being a great project, which now we're taking steps to make. So I'll end it there, but I'd just also like to say thank you very much to all of our sponsors, our hosts here. It's been a great time to be here in Santiago, and I hope that next time I'm here, I'm able to deliver my presentation in Spanish as well. Thank you very much.